Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you about the rise in homelessness, the causes and possible solutions. I will now start my speech. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1933, in his study on poverty, George Orwell reported on the score of people sleeping under the Seine bridges in Paris, and the 50 men shivering under Charing Cross Bridge in London. If I had not told you the author was George Orwell, you might be forgiven for thinking this report a reflection of the current situation as it stands today, and not 9 decades earlier. Rough sleepers have once again become a regular sight in London, regardless of the weather. Indeed, their numbers have tripled since 2010. And this is by no means singular to the two cities described in Orwell's memoir. The number of homeless people, be it people living in temporary accommodation or people sleeping rough on the streets, is soaring in every European city. In America, the situation might seem to be milder at first, with homelessness on the decline in general. But if you look closer at some of the bigger cities, you will see that in fact the inverse is true. Take, for example, San Francisco, where the number of homeless people has jumped by 19% over the last 2 years. So why is this the case, and how can we counteract this worrying development? In post-war America, homelessness dropped so dramatically that some sociologists were predicting that it would be completely eradicated. Sadly, this did not prove to be the case, but that drop at that time can give us some insight into what might be the primary cause of homelessness, and that is housing costs. Back then, housing costs were relatively low, whereas now they are rising relentlessly. You can see this when you look at how much tenants spend of their total income on rent. Back then, 1 in 4 tenants spent 30% of their income on rent, whereas today this figure stands at 1 in 2. And the link between homelessness and housing costs is clear. Studies have shown that a 10% increase in housing costs in some of the more expensive cities will directly result in an 8% increase in homelessness. There's also another reason for homelessness which might not be quite as clear-cut, and that is that cities with relatively low numbers of homeless people, such as Tokyo and Munich, seem to be united in their penchant for tough love. Conservatives claim that homelessness and the rise in homelessness might be due to softer policing tactics, particularly those adopted in the 70s with respect to public drunkenness. But I personally feel this argument does not hold much water. It seems to be based on political opinion and not on hard evidence. But I do think it worth mentioning. So with this in mind, how can we tackle homelessness? Can we do something to solve this seemingly insurmountable problem? Or do we have to concede that not much has changed since George Orwell put pen to paper in 1933? One suggestion is that the state could do more. By scaling up rent subsidies, this might be a first step, although countries such as Great Britain seem to be going in the opposite direction and actually cutting rent subsidies for the poorest members of society. For me, moves such as this in Great Britain are inexplicable. We know that cuts often have the opposite effect to that intended. If there are more homeless people on the streets due to cuts in rent subsidies, then we'll have to see also more men and women in blue on the streets, and it also puts a greater strain on our health sector. And these two things have to be funded somehow. Moreover, people living on the streets might find it more difficult to find a job and can therefore not contribute to society and to the economy. So while cuts might seem to be saving money, usually the costs end up popping up elsewhere. Another solution, if subsidies are not an option, would be for the state to build more housing. In Singapore and in Finland, for example, this has had tremendous success. In Singapore, 80% of residents buy government-built flats at very low rates, and the result? Homelessness is verging on zero. Meanwhile, Finland has eschewed the popular policies of privatising public housing and is in fact building more public housing instead. This means that the government can house homeless people in their own homes and not in shelters. And let me just reiterate, when people live independently in their own homes, they're much more likely to be able to find a job and contribute to the economy. Moreover, in Finland, homeless people are not required to quit drinking and quit drugs before gaining access to accommodation, which is an approach espoused in America. In Finland, accommodation comes first, support comes second. Finally, the state could also make it easier for others to build more housing. In many places, NIMBYist red tape has made it impossible to build more housing and has drastically inflated market prices. Looser planning rules, such as those in Germany, Switzerland, and more recently in Japan, have decreased the number of homeless people. The looser planning rules in Japan have meant that housing costs in Tokyo, for example, have dropped, and the number of homeless people has also dropped as a result, by 80% over the last 20 years. So, as we can see, there are solutions to homelessness. Whether or not European countries will opt for these solutions is doubtful. As we can see, some countries, such as Great Britain, going in a completely opposite direction. I am concerned that homelessness is often sidelined and its seriousness is overlooked. In this day and age, people tend to throw their weight behind just one issue, and in a time of concerns about climate change, World War III breaking out, homelessness might take a back seat. But I think we shouldn't forget the fate of millions of people who have fallen by the wayside and are down on their luck. There are a multitude of reasons why people end up on the streets, and they deserve our empathy and our support. They also require our assistance, help getting back on their feet, so they can live a life in dignity and start afresh. Thank you.